this month's speaker. Okay, and this month's speaker is Phoebe Parker-Shames, Dr. Phoebe Parker-Shames, and she is homegrown here from our area. She has a lot of fans in this room and probably out there on Zoom. Her presentation is going to be on cannabis cultivation and the environment, lessons and opportunities. Join us for a research presentation and discussion about cannabis land use change in Southern Oregon and its ecological implications for wild flora and fauna. Dr. Parker-Shames will present some of her work studying outdoor private land cannabis farming in Josephine County during the early phase of recreational cannabis legalization. She will share some of the ecological lessons learned, ongoing research gaps, and opportunities to improve conservation outcomes in the cannabis industry. Dr. Phoebe Parker-Shames, she, her, is an interdisciplinary researcher who grew up in Southern Oregon and studies the ecological outcomes of cannabis legalization. She is currently a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley, working with doctors Brashares and Chris Schell. Hopefully I said that right. She is also part of the Cannabis Research Center at Berkeley. So with that, I will stop my share and we'll give Phoebe a chance to share her presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared.
Thank you.
Did everybody see my screen okay?
Yes, it looks good.
Great. All right.
For the room.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks Rachel for the introduction. My name is Dr. Phoebe Parker-Shames, and I am, as mentioned, a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley, where I study cannabis and the environment. And I also work with the Cannabis Research Center here at UC Berkeley. I'm here tonight to talk about my dissertation research on cannabis in Southern Oregon, mostly in Josephine County, and some of the broader lessons that I've learned through studying this industry. I'm going to preface this by just saying that I am not an expert on either native plants or birds. So instead, I'm going to focus this talk a little bit more at the broader ecosystem and conservation level. So I'm going to just start a little bit with my background. So as mentioned, I'm from Southern Oregon. My family lived in Takelma for decades as part of the Back to the Land movement, and I largely grew up in Ashland. So yes, there are a lot of familiar faces for me here tonight. And cannabis in rural areas of the West has its roots in the Back to the Land and hippie communities, which is where I have my roots. So this is a photo from Takelma, Oregon, in Josephine County. And places like this have been tied to cannabis in ways that are cultural, spiritual, and economic. And this history feeds into the dynamics of the industry today in terms of where and how cannabis is grown. And because of my connection to this history, I'm able to bring a unique set of tools and perspectives to bear on cannabis topics. So essentially, I view my research on cannabis, while rooted in concerns for the natural environment, to be framed as part of a social ecological system. And this understanding helps me situate my ecological research within a broader context. Now, I'm sure for this audience, I don't necessarily need to convince all of you of why studying cannabis and the environment is important. We certainly need a better understanding of cannabis cultivation, how it impacts local ecosystems, and how we can grow it more sustainably. You're all currently living in an area that has seen enormous changes from cannabis legalization and changes in land use subsequently. So I suspect each and every one of you has noticed that in one way or another. So instead, I want to think about conservation issues with cannabis as the mirror we can hold up to land use conflicts in the West more broadly. So today I'll give a broad overview of my research, which focused on private land, outdoor cannabis production within sort of that early period of legalization. And then I will explain a little bit about how my work relates to the following themes. So land use, wildfire, water, human-wildlife conflict, and rural livelihoods. So as an overview, of my dissertation research. It was sort of composed of 4 main sets of questions. The first being, how is cannabis distributed? And where might we be concerned about its environmental impact? The second was, what drives cannabis land use over time? And what are the social or environmental contexts for those drivers? Next, how do wildlife respond to active cannabis farming? And then finally, what specifically is the role of light and noise disturbance in wildlife response to cannabis? So for each of these, just as sort of a broad overview of how I actually answered these questions. First, I mapped farms using Google Earth imagery, and then compared distributions of cannabis with sensitive habitat features like rivers and streams, different wildlife predator distributions, coho salmon ranges, things like that. And then for the second set of questions, I interviewed cannabis farmers and used the interview information to help inform 3 different computer-based models of cannabis land use and development. And then for the third set of questions, I monitored wildlife on and surrounding cannabis farms using wildlife cameras. So for this, mainly focusing on large ground birds and medium to large mammals. And then finally, for the fourth question, which is what I'm also continuing to work on now in my postdoc, I've been simulating light and noise disturbance using controlled field experiments and then measuring the responses of multiple species across multiple taxa. So insects, small mammals, herps, birds, large mammals, bats. I feel like I might be forgetting one. A lot of different species in this component. And the majority of the work, except for those experiments, were conducted in Josephine County and the Klamath-Siskiyous. And the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion is, as I suspect probably all of you already know, one of the most biodiverse areas of North America and contains multiple threatened and endangered species like coho salmon and fishers. I won't go into detail on all of my research methods today, but rather explain how my results relate to some broader themes that also affect this area, and I really believe the West more broadly. So starting with land use. So from my research, we found that after the first season of recreational legalization, private land cannabis in Josephine County covered a very small total land area, so about 330 acres, which is less than 0.5% of all land area, and also less than the area that vineyards cover in the county. And as a visualization of what that looks like, this is these are hotspot maps from Josephine County. So the red squares in this don't necessarily correspond to individual farms, but rather show the area of the areas in which cannabis is most likely to be found. So it shows clustering essentially of grows. And on the left in the map B, we have the regional hotspots. So across the entire county, where are you most likely to find cannabis and where are you least likely to find cannabis? And then in panel C, we have on a per watershed basis, where are the hot spots and where are the cool spots? So from this map, we can see that cannabis production was clustered both at a regional and individual watershed level. It was also expanding rapidly with legalization. So 67% of farms were not visible in the pre-legalization time points. It was also pervasive across private land parcels, with 6% of all private land parcels containing high confidence cannabis of more than 4 plants. So that represents over 2,000 individual parcels across the county. And obviously the caveat on this is 2016 data, and I don't have an update for any more recent time periods since then. Now, in the course of carrying out this research, I have realized that what this means both for cannabis and for other land uses in this area is that we have to do a better job of including community dialogue about where we want development to take place, as well as to be more transparent about that decision-making process and potentially even update the structures that enable that dialogue. So for example, for this project, I ended up digging into zoning and parcel maps and realizing that a lot of those categories don't always line up with the ways in which we're actually using or viewing or valuing the land. And what I would really love to see would be community forums that include growers, neighbors, researchers, groups like all of you, and regulators to discuss the reality of this industry, and then create maps that help illustrate potential future scenarios for cannabis development on the landscape that take into account trade-offs with placement and development. And as a first step towards envisioning some of these maps, as part of my dissertation, I created an online interactive story map that you're all welcome to explore. You can find it on the Cannabis Research Center's website, which is crc.berkeley.edu. And I encourage all of you to check it out. Once I stop screen sharing, I'll try to remember to put a link to it in the chat. So this foundation in thinking about land use itself provides the baseline for us to understand a lot of the other themes that I'm going to talk about, a lot of the other conflicts around cannabis. So for example, wildfire, which may not even be one that we think of often as being an issue for cannabis. But by now, all of us in this area are quite familiar with the risks of wildfire to both human and ecological communities. So as part of the Cannabis Research Center, we did a study where we assessed California-based cannabis farms, although I think this analysis probably really relevant for Oregon as well. And we found that the majority of cannabis farms were located in areas with a high risk for wildfire. And when you think about sort of that clustering effect that we saw with the landscapes, this sort of makes sense. So if a few farms are located in high fire risk, then probably most of the farms in the area are all going to be in a high wildfire risk region. So again, that land use really is important for thinking about the conflicts that result. Also with wildfire, I think it again mirrors these issues of fire risk with rural development, and particularly in wildland urban interface spaces. So in creating plans for how cannabis farms can adapt to fire risk, I believe we can help rural communities broadly grapple with this ongoing climate risk factor. So now the concern that often goes hand in hand with these worries about wildfire are also the concerns about drought and water use. So for my research on cannabis in Josephine County, found that cannabis was often grown close to freshwater sources, and that those sources tended to be smaller tributary streams. Some of the other research led by the Cannabis Research Center has also indicated that while many farmers do have storage that reduces the impact of water withdrawals during the summer, a lot of them also struggle to obtain enough storage to completely reduce, especially the need for like late summer water withdrawals. And I'll just add that this is an area of future research because we actually don't have a lot of great data yet on water use for cannabis. The sort of existing literature out there is kind of all over the map. So hopefully in the coming years, we're going to get a better grasp for how much water cannabis is using, the range of different water use practices. Now, ultimately, what I've learned from cannabis research and water is that cannabis really reflects a lot of our climate anxieties. So with or without cannabis, we need to be promoting sustainable agricultural water use and storage, and expecting and planning for drought, as well as updating some of these policies that we have in place, like the use it or lose it and first in time, first in right policies that often provide the wrong incentives in terms of long-term planning for drought. Next, I want to talk about human-wildlife conflict. So this is sort of the topic that really got me interested in cannabis as a research topic, and is something that's been a lot of the focus of my work. So for my research on active cannabis farms, using images sort of like the one I have here from a farm with a quail on it, we found that 13 out of 24 species responded to the presence of cannabis in some way. However, the response is really species specific, meaning that there was a lot of variation depending on which species we looked at. So some species seem to avoid cannabis. So for instance, deer and most of our ground bird species, whereas some species were actually more likely to be found on or near to a cannabis farm. So for example, ground squirrels and gray foxes. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about this was that a lot of these spatial behavioral patterns for wildlife really mimic the research that's coming out of places that study rural housing development, especially around like places like Southern California. And so that in turn got me thinking about and wondering which components of these cannabis farms wildlife were really responding to. And that has sort of led into some of these field experiment work that I've been doing, where we actually mimic, as in this photo, we're mimicking some of the light and sound specifically from farms and looking at the response of wildlife. And yet again, we are seeing very species specific and also really taxa specific responses to these disturbance sources. So for example, most of the flying insects that we're sampling are really attracted to the light. But the birds across all of the different bird species are very varied. So depending on the season, depending on the site, depending on the species, there are wildly different behavioral patterns. So we're still sort of sorting through what all of those data mean and what those, trying to figure out what the actual patterns are. But ultimately, the hope is that this research can help inform farm level best management practices for cannabis. However, I think the implications are far broader. So when we think about our world as a whole, it's getting brighter and louder all the time, and land conversion remains one of the greatest threats to biodiversity worldwide. So again, with or without cannabis, we're faced with this big challenge of how to live alongside wildlife. And I don't think it's unreasonable to hope that in cannabis, we have an opportunity to try out new ways of regulating an industry with the environment in mind, so that we can apply those best management practices and regulations to other industries as well. Of course, this all comes with a balance. So in my research, when I interviewed cannabis farmers, many expressed the difficulty balancing sustainable practices with trying to stay afloat in a rapidly changing industry. So this is an example of a quote from one of the farmers I talked with. They said, "Most people are just looking at the economics. If it weren't so hard to make a living and support a family by growing sustainably, I think most people would be open to it." Current research by some of my colleagues at the Cannabis Research Center also suggests that the cannabis industry itself is industrializing rapidly, which means it's moving towards more large-scale production, with smaller farmers losing the ability to keep pace in either the legal or illegal markets. Which for me means that I'm not only concerned about the environmental impacts of relying on industrialized and indoor production practices, but I'm also concerned about what a shift away from small-scale farming means for rural communities that have come to rely on cannabis. The struggles of the cannabis industry are a reminder of the importance of figuring out how to live sustainably in rural areas, which are often dependent on the land and natural resources, be it cannabis or timber, for their livelihoods. Many of the farmers I spoke with wanted more education, research, and best management practices. So finding a way to preserve sustainable, small-scale agriculture in a way that supports both the environment and rural livelihoods is not an issue that is unique to cannabis. But I do hope that cannabis can help us find some resolutions. So for concluding thoughts, cannabis, much like any emerging industry, has its environmental impacts, and some of them can be fairly severe. But the trick will be in how we try to approach resolving the conflicts that arise with this industry. And these conflicts aren't new, and they're not necessarily unique to cannabis. But I think if we can resolve the conflicts around cannabis and land use, wildfire, water, human wildlife conflict, and rural livelihoods, we'll have a roadmap for the rest of the Western US. So with that, I want to say thank you to my funders and my research partners and to everyone here. I'll take any questions that you have. And I'm also obviously I'm willing to talk more about the actual research process or results as well if people have questions about that.
Okay, thank you, Phoebe. Vanessa, shall I do the questions or would you like me to lead from the room here?
I think it would be great if you led the questions. I'll go typing mine in the chat.
Okay, great. Phoebe, will you stop your share and then I will get the chat up so I can see that and be able to see people better. Thank you. Thank you. That was so interesting. Okay. Chat. Here we go. All right, let me get to the back. Oh, excuse me, there are a lot of other things in there. Just a second.
It's the last one.
Okay, I'm curious to know what Phoebe means by water storage. What are some of the ways to store water?
Yeah, so it depends on in part like the regulations in a particular area as to what types of water storage are or are not allowed. Some of them include like holding ponds that are open air. I know a lot of people at this point are relying on those really big plastic water storage tubs. I think those are sort of the main ones. There are also like some smaller scale portable like large water cubes that people have probably seen around. Yeah, essentially it's a way for you to be able to take water during a wet season like the winter time and then store it so that you can use it at a time when you wouldn't want to be drawing water from a well or from the stream.
Yeah, I know that if you have irrigation for other crops, you can sometimes have a pond that's called an irrigation bulge, so that it'll be drained at least once in the year, but it's just a way of accumulating and using the water. So that might be another thing that people are using if they have access to that.
Yeah. And then of course you have to be careful to not let it just breed bullfrogs and
right. And they have a 2-year life cycle. So if you drain it once a year, you shouldn't become a source for that, theoretically. Let's see, what kind of incentives are farmers looking for to get them over the line in favor of sustainability and wildfire protection?
yeah. So I think one of the big ones is refining the process of legalization. So I think a lot of farmers have sort of decided that the legal route is probably going to be the best one for preserving their ability to grow sustainably. Although I will note that some of the people I talked to had concerns that the restrictions of the legal industry itself made it harder to do sustainable practices, especially around things like intercropping or rotation. Sorry, this is my cat.
That's great.
Or only, I have to say that for the bird people.
It's the Kraken.
Yeah, so lost my train of thought.
They're saying that the laws make it harder to do the sustainable sometimes.
Right. So sometimes the laws, it feels like, make it harder to use the best sustainable practices, but on the whole, it seems like most of the people I've talked to have felt like the legal industry provides a way to have access to a market while growing in sort of more sustainable ways. The big issue is that there are a lot of barriers, financial barriers and structural barriers to actually making it into the legal market. And then once you're in the legal market, actually making sure that your product can get to sale. And so I think people are looking for a lot more transparency, a lot less sort of different agencies that they have to move through to actually get regulated or get approved. And then also sometimes because it's so county specific, both in Oregon and California, there's a lot of like local control, which is important but also means that some places have bigger barriers than others. It also, this is contributing to some of that industrialization effect where like if you have a lot of money already, you have an easier way to get into the market. So that's part of why we see those large scale, larger industrial. So there are thoughts about creating like granting programs to actually give financial support and legal aid to small farms that are doing sustainable agriculture to try to get them through the process. As part of the Cannabis Research Center, we actually have a full policy document of recommendations that we're going to be releasing in the next, hopefully in the next month, once it's sort of cleared its way through the California legislature, where we actually lay out some specific things that we recommend in order to preserve a space for small farmers. But the point of it is basically like actually work it into the policy itself, actually regulate and say, we are specifically designing a program that will make space for small farms to persist in the market.
Great. That's great. Good. Is any part of that like the carbon, that kind of level of sustainable agriculture, like the carbon sequestration things, that it's encouraging regenerative agricultural practices and things like that? Is it related to that, some of those?
Yeah, I think I think there's certainly some groups out there who are really into like cannabis and regenerative agriculture. There's also just sort of like on the broader scale, some of the comparative analysis that's been done for outdoor versus indoor versus like large scale greenhouse production of cannabis really indicates that like the CO2 production, the overall like emissions of indoor and greenhouse is a lot higher than outdoor. Obviously, there's also like the equity issues where we want to maintain a space in the market where like a lot of particularly like Black communities in like the Bay Area, they have a legacy of indoor production because of the illicit history. And so certainly like for equity reasons, there are like some facets of the indoor and greenhouse market that I think it's really important to preserve. But in terms of like the overall market and sort of carbon impacts, it does seem like outdoor has a lot less of an impact in that way.
Interesting and complicated. Did you study the use of pesticides on cannabis farms and whether this affects surrounding water and animals?
Yeah, so when I talked to cannabis farmers, we did talk a little bit about the pesticide use. Most of the concerns around sort of heavy pesticide intoxicant use are actually from public land trespass, so-called trespass grows, which is where you get a lot of the news stories about them using like anticoagulant rodenticides or other really toxic substances. On the whole, the private land production is not using those as much, partly because when you're not under that much dense forest canopy cover, they don't tend to have as many of the rodent issues. So they tend to have more like insect pest-based issues, but less of like rodents, eating the cambium all around the plant as the, yeah. Okay,
interesting. Did you monitor nutrient or pesticide runoff?
No, I didn't. So I did talk with farmers about what sort of pesticides they are using. Most of the farmers I was working with were either legal grows, and all legal grows are required to follow a very specified list of pesticides that they can use. Which they're not allowed to call it organic, but it is basically the list of pesticides that are approved for organic agriculture. And so generally the people I talked to were sticking to that list, or were even more conservative than that list. But obviously I have a slightly biased set of people who I interviewed. So I don't know that I want to say that that speaks for the practices of all of the farmers.
Okay. And Vanessa says, I'm curious if you could elaborate on the interdisciplinary nature of this work. Did you work with social scientists? What was your experience like interviewing people to gain a better perspective on natural systems?
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the most critical pieces of this research, and also one of the things I'm really grateful for with the Cannabis Research Center. So the Cannabis Research Center brings in folks from all sorts of different disciplines. So we've got anthropologists, geographers, economists, hydrologists, wildlife biologists, all sorts of different specialties. And so it's been a really great space to learn from social scientists, incorporate some of that information into the work that I do. So my second chapter, where I did the cannabis farmer interviews and integrated that into my modeling, that one is the most sort of explicitly interdisciplinary of the work that I've done. But I think that that process was really critical for helping me to understand the ways in which cannabis sort of functions in this system, because so much of the environmental impacts are really influenced by the history and the culture and the people who are doing the cultivating.
Right, right, great. That's great. Probably a lot of fields could benefit from that forced interdisciplinary collaboration. Okay, and Pepper Trail's with us. He said, you didn't mention the big issue of anticoagulant use on cannabis grows and its effects on wildlife, including predators like fishers and spotted owls. Do you think this is mainly a problem with industrialized scale and or illegal growth? So you did touch on that kind of a little earlier, but.
Yeah. So I really was interested in, with my work, focusing on the private land industry, because I felt like the public land was where most of the existing research, especially when I started, had been done. So that's where a lot of that information that we get about the anticoagulant rodenticides is from, specifically those sort of production styles. So I was really interested in, like, let's fill in the gap for this, the style of production that we don't know as much about, and that's also the predominant part of the market at this point.
Right, excellent. So then Christy has a good follow-up. Any observations on Pacific fishers in your research on your wildlife cams? So
so part of what I was doing with the mapping work was I collaborated with some partners from Oregon State University who developed I think it's the full state, but it might have just been multiple counties in like most of Southern Oregon. They developed essentially like habitat projection models that said, here's where we think it's a high likelihood of having fishers, or I think it was fishers, ringtails, mountain lions, coyotes, and foxes. I think that might be the list. And so we used their models and compared them to the hotspots. And so we did find that there was pretty significant, I was actually really surprised at the level of overlap between the projected fisher habitat and the hotspots of cannabis. That being said, on my actual cameras, I got a grand total of 1 fisher detection.
Okay, well, that's still exciting, huh? Interesting. Yeah. Okay, Christina Lefevre says, what about the plastic? Why is it not required that they clean up the pesticides they use every crop year? And maybe she means the plastic. I'm not positive about that. What about all the plastic that is left when the grower stops using the land? What is the load to the county landfills with all of this?
This is actually brings up a topic that I often get really frustrated about, where we have the interface of environmental issues with cannabis and enforcement, because a lot of times with enforcement, part of what they're doing is coming through and making a grow site unusable. So they will slash open the water tanks, they'll pile all the plastic up in sort of a big pile of plastic, and they'll like leave fertilizer bags and things, because you can get, part of it is the funding structure for enforcement. Like there's a lot more money out there to bust a grow than there is to actually do the cleanup and remediation after. So some of the time when you're seeing a lot of this leftover plastic, I mean, sometimes it's, yeah, people are not being very responsible and they're not cleaning up after themselves, but sometimes it's actually that enforcement has removed the people off of the grow and then they've left the plastic. So that is also like a side point of mine that I really want us to couple any enforcement money with at the same time remediation and cleanup money, because I don't think it helps us to have that extra trash lying around. That being said, so plastic concerns, I think that is actually like a really big area for like best management practice research, is figuring out ways to support these heavy plants as they grow with something other than plastic netting, because I mean, the growers don't want to deal with it either if there's an animal that's caught in the plastic in the plant and, you know, knocking around and harming the plant itself. So it's a scenario that nobody is a fan of if it happens. So I think there is a lot of sort of concerted effort to try to figure out what is a better material to help with the plant production. So the other issue is a lot with like plastic mulch. And this is where we get to the education piece too, where, you know, some people hear plastic mulch and think that it's like mulch, and that after you're done, you can, you know, till it into the soil, and not realize like, no, it's plastic. You actually can't do that. So I think there is like a lot of education pieces out there too, to help people learn some better growing practices, because a lot of the people coming into cannabis farming are not necessarily coming from other types of farming. So they don't always have that knowledge that they're bringing with them.
Right. So that dovetails into the, one of the questions that I had, and I was wondering, you were talking about, oh, it'd be great to have this, all these people together, and so we could all talk about it, the growers and the ecologists and the enforcers and all that stuff. And I wondered if you had connected at all with our Southern Oregon Research and Extension through Oregon State University in Jackson County. And they have Gordon Jones and now Govinda Shreth, who is our cannabis specialist, have been leading cannabis growers forums. And I know that Gordon just mentioned recently that he and I'm not sure, maybe Govinda also, but they're going to be looking into like cover crops for intergrowing with the cannabis, and that gets to that plastic kind of question in terms of that. But so did you connect with them in any way, or have you?
No, so the majority of this work was started in 2017. So I think I was a little bit before. I think a lot of like the more formal infrastructure had sort of gotten there for cannabis, but it's really exciting to hear that with that outreach and extension work, because that's been something that has been really
well. Gordon, I think they started at around the same time as you, but they were just beginning, and the forums, that was before Govinda came on. I know because Judith Ann was talking to me about your even making your decision about what you were going to study for your PhD and stuff. So I think they got an early start, but it's still really in its infancy. And then the way it's gone here with this boom and bust and kind of leveling out, it's like, it's just been such a crazy kind of roller coaster, the whole event all the way through. But anyway, maybe you'll connect with them in the future.
Yeah, I would love to chat with them actually.
And then the other question that I had, then I'll get back to the chat there, but I was wondering, so my job is with OSU and I have the land steward program, and one of the questions that people have a lot, including Judith Ann, is like, how do I keep the ground squirrels out of my garden? Or how do I keep the raccoons out of my garden? And I was wondering if that final bullet point of mimicking kind of the disturbances with the light and maybe sound and stuff, if there might be some kind of tangential use of that where it's actually used where people don't want animals, kind of pest animals with their crops or something like that. Have you looked into that?
I haven't. I will say, so our study design is specifically intended, at least, to not to try to bypass the question of habituation. So any sort of use for that as like a management tool, if you had it running long term, you would have to deal with an animal eventually learning like, oh, this signal that I interpreted as, you know, potential danger actually didn't lead to danger. So now I don't care about it anymore. But I certainly would think that intermittent noise, more than the lights even, I was sort of surprised about that. I thought the lights would be more impactful than the noise, but so far it seems like the noise has been the big deterrent. So yeah, that's I think it could have a potential use there. Of course, then you have to, well, you're
so Judith had just blessed AC/DC on intermittent intervals at night in your neighborhood.
and it continuously sends out, vibratory sounds.
Okay, so she's saying that she's been using some kind of device that you kind of put into the ground and it sends out a vibration or a sound intermittently. So apparently people are working on that. Let's see. Okay, Artie. Okay, and we got that. All right. I think Dr. Parker-Shames mentioned land conversion similar to what is going on in SoCal. Can she describe that conversion and where it is happening here?
Yeah. So the land conversion that I'm talking about in Southern California is where we see sort of exurban development. So that is really like housing development. So for especially, and actually the case of Southern California, a lot of places is actually these like wealthier subdivisions where people are, want their beautiful mansion right up next to the hillside. Maybe they'll learn the lesson with the wildfire risk. Maybe they won't. But that's sort of the development pattern we've been seeing there. And some of the things that are really similar is that you've got sort of little like hotspots of development that sort of interdigitate into these wild spaces. And a lot of those spatial patterns really resemble what we see with cannabis and how it develops over time.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about those clusters that you saw? What were the reasons for that? Was it because of good agricultural land or kind of a social impact, or do you know what was driving that?
I didn't really necessarily until I did the interview process. And so what I really learned from that was it is tied to a couple different things. One is that farmers really talked about your success in the industry in many ways depends on if your neighbors like you or not. So if you know that this place already has a farm and that it's been functioning for a few years, chances are that neighborhood's gonna be a little bit more okay with cannabis being grown there. They're not gonna give you quite as hard of a time. Maybe they're not gonna call the sheriff on you every other day. So that it sort of becomes an indication that that area is okay to grow in. And so that's part of it for the clustering. And then part of it is also the process by which people learn and operate their farms. So sometimes the best way people learn for how to grow is by moving somewhere close to another farm or even working on another farm for a while and then moving next door and starting their own. And so there's sort of a network way in which people are actually learning how to produce. And then another piece is labor. So you have these sort of intervals with the production of cannabis where you need a really intense amount of labor for a short amount of time. And having farms really close together means that either this sort of migrant labor force can go from one farm to another, or you can all band together and say, today we're helping at Johnny's farm, tomorrow we're going to help at Ada's farm. Like, you go around and assist each other.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, and then Christina had kind of a follow-up, some clarifying, but she said that she heard that people were just tilling it in. Does that happen with the plastic? This is returning back to the plastic question.
Yeah, and what I've heard from people is that it comes from a not actually understanding.
It's the mulch thing that you were talking about, that they thought it was like a biodegradable plastic or something.
Right.
Okay.
Anyone have questions in here?
Yeah, anyone in the room have questions? So I'll repeat them, so because they can't hear you.
Question about indoor greenhouse grows and light usage at night. And if you did any studies on light pollution or impacts on wildlife, nocturnal wildlife.
Okay, so Julie's question is thinking about the illuminated greenhouses and wondering if you looked at the impacts of those lighted greenhouses on wildlife at night, nocturnal wildlife especially.
Yeah, so that's part of what we're hoping to get at with the field experiments is, so we're not, this one is less observational. We're actually specifically taking the lights themselves and using them, sort of doing treatment and control periods with and without lights to look at the impacts just of the light itself on a whole range, including nocturnal species. The actual study, like of existing light patterns has been a little difficult. We did try to do an analysis at one point using some of the like night sky databases, but unfortunately, the scale right now that we have data on nighttime illumination is really coarse. So I think it's like about a 5 kilometer or 10 kilometer resolution. So it's just at this point in time, we don't have a good data set to then, you know, relate it to the concentration of cannabis farms, for instance, to say like, are we seeing greater illumination in regions with high cannabis farms than regions with fewer cannabis farms? So that's sort of a little bit of a, we'll hopefully as ever geospatial information seems like every year gets better, that analysis probably will be feasible in the coming years, but was not at the time when I was looking at it.
Okay, interesting. Any other questions here? Okay, I have an unrelated question. Have you read the book An Immense World by Ed Young about how animals sense the world?
No, but
I bet you would get things out of it that could be applied to your research. It looks at all different kinds of animals, including lights. There's a great anecdote of when they do the 9/11 memorial and they put the beams of lights up there, that migrating birds just get like stuck in those beams of light, and after a certain density they turn the lights off so they can go, and then they wait for it to fill back up again. There's just one example. It's a great book. I recommend it to everybody. Okay. An Immense World by Ed Young talks about all different kinds of things, all kinds of animals, how animals sense the world. But yeah, thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you for joining us. Lots of interesting things, and I look forward to it coming forward. It's still an unfolding topic. And
you want to put anything in the chat? There was something earlier that you tried to remember to.
were you going to try and put something into the chat?
oh,
A link?
a link for the, yeah, thank you for the reminder.
Cannabis Research Center or whatever.
Yeah.
If you could spell it, Zoom recording. COT, or you can, or whatever.
Okay, well.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat.
Okay, so it's crcberkeley.edu/maps/Josephine/Oregon or -Oregon.
You can find it. It's on, if you go to crc.berkeley.edu, I think it's on the homepage under story map.
Okay, great, wonderful. All right, yay. Getting claps in here. Thank you. So